keep track?
Sure. You want to go ahead and do that, Tracy?
Yep, give me 1 second and I'll pull it right up.
Okay.
Okay. Nancy Baker,
Here.
Ronnie Beal, Jack Kahn, Ira Dove, Joyce Edwards is here in person, Rick French here,
Here.
Dr. Heck, he's given his proxy to Rick, Pam Holcomb is here in person, Judy Johansson,
Here.
Billy Kennedy,
Here.
Michael Lavender has given his proxy to Rick French, Pat McGinnis,
Here.
Mike Norris. I think I heard that as here. Mr. Norris, are you here? Marsh Pittman,
I'm here.
Steve Smith is here in person, Mandy Stone.
Here.
Let me go back real quick just to see Jack Kahn or Ira Dove. I think they had both indicated they would be here. Have you joined? All right, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I believe. We need one more, don't we, Kathy? It's 11. It's 11, but we're good.
Okay,
We have a quorum.
thanks for everybody's attention here.
Okay.
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay. Brian, report of the Chief Executive Officer. You want to get right into this?
Yes, sir. We'll do our best to keep this to an hour, and the challenge will be
Who just joined?
It's Jack Condren.
Okay. A lot of what I'll be discussing, and really all of us will be discussing, will undoubtedly lead to many questions you have, and we'll be able to cover those at the board meeting. This isn't intended at all to replace that, but just to kind of get some issues in front of you in advance of Thursday. So that being said, we'll cover things with somewhat of a broad brush, and it's going to be very, very challenging. I take my responsibility to make things simple to heart. And I will tell you, we have a collection of very, very, very strong drivers that exist at the state level now that are affecting all of what we do, and it makes it difficult to identify things with a lot of specificity. So that's going to be my disclaimer.
Who just joined?
This is Mike Norris. My signal keeps jumping in and out, so I just dialed back in.
Thank you.
So on the big list, we've spoken about some very significant legislation. We've also spoken, and I'm headed to Raleigh tomorrow morning for a meeting with the Secretary specific to special needs planning. That continues to be a big feature. Underneath that is also discussions and potential legislation around governance. And then we have the state budget. And with that, of course, we have the governor's iteration of that. We have the Senate's, which we're going to pay particular attention to. Pretty soon we'll have a House response, and I think it's very, very likely that probably by the end of next month or early part of next month, we'll end up in conference committee. So it's a big roller coaster right now. And I think probably the icing on the cake, I'm sure everybody's seen it by now, was the cardinal audit that came out late last week and all the associated news stories with that. But we're going to start off with a very quick rundown on the impact of the Senate budget. There is, unfortunately, a plan to, how could I put it, not accept the non-recurring nature of the reductions that occurred in single stream in the last biennium. So for example, in the governor's budget, all the money, and it was $262 million over 2 years, was restored in single stream funding. And for the new folks, that is the funding that goes to deal with services for the non-Medicaid population that is extremely precious to us. In the Senate's version of the budget, they created, they started with a base budget that already had that amount taken out for the 2 years, but then modified that slightly. And they did so with a recurring and a non-recurring amount, then also with an intergovernmental transfer payment that is essentially the state's share of risk reserve. So while it doesn't fit into being a single stream reduction, it fits into being a reduction that we have to pay for with administration money, so it acts the same way in our budget. So the totals on that in for 17-18, again in the Senate version of the budget, single stream reductions are a total of $69 million and change. Intergovernmental transfers of almost $18 million, so a total of $87 million statewide in reductions with single stream and IGT. And then in 18 and 19 it actually goes up to be $101 million and 119, just under $120 million when the intergovernmental transfer amount is added in. So we're not talking about a small amount of money here. And again, if you believe the budget language from last year, you would not have expected for any of this to be recurring because that was the language that was used. One major difference in this, aside from the fact that it's split between being recurring and non-recurring, is that the methodology for determining the contributions, if you will, because they use the same language, where we are not, and I'm going to quote it to you, during each year of the 17-19 fiscal biennium, each LME MCO shall offer at least the same level of service utilization as during the 2014-15 fiscal year. This was the same language as in last year's budget bill. However, the way these reductions have been taken, and again I say reductions, yet we're supposed to fill the void with fund balance, okay? The methodology is different. This budget language used the amount of available cash and the anticipated reinvestment plans to come up with a factor that drove a methodology for determining the reductions. So just to make it simple, the reductions, and I'll go by percentage, and again, you're talking about next year's $87 million. Alliance's contribution is 21%, Cardinals is 25%, East Point is 9.5%, Partners is 9.6%, Sand Hills is 18.7%, Trillium is 8.1%, and ours is 8.5%. So that gives you some idea of the range. So if you put that into perspective for us, the recurring amount of that for 17-18 is about 1.7 million. The non-recurring amount is about 3.3, intergovernmental transfer 2.3. So the total of all cuts for us for the first year of the biennium is about 7.4 million. Next year it is right under 9 million. So again, just in terms of scale, you have an appreciation for what we're dealing with. Now, how does that affect our budget? Well, we have the challenge of multiple drivers when we step this down to our own same budget. We have been spending, we've had a vigorous reinvestment plan. And as a result,
Ira just joined.
Thanks, Ira.
Hey, Ira.
as a result of having a vigorous reinvestment plan, we've spent a good chunk of money of fund balance. That's both the good news and the bad news, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it. If we had not spent that money, we would have been in the boat with Alliance, Cardinal, Sand Hills, and others, where we would have had a much larger payment that we would have had to make to the state. The downside, if you will, I guess, and the other upside is that, we did a lot of good with it. It's put us in, I would say, arguably the best position of any LME MCO in the state in terms of moving forward for the 1115 waiver and whole person care, but yet, when it came to time to negotiate our rates going forward with Mercer and DMA, none of the expenses for which we used fund balance were accepted by them. So whether it was a service expense, whether it was an expense around administration for things that we are advancing with whole person care, they wouldn't accept any of that as part of expense for which they would do a calculation for our PMPM. So we were kind of left hanging out there. So what does that mean? That means we had expenses for which we were using fund balance that essentially are not sustainable. And we are going to have to find a way in a budget process to pull those expenses back in and limit some of what we were doing, both in terms of our own operation and in terms of the service system. Now, there are some very high-level pieces of data that we could go into around this. In terms of our expenses, of course, everyone understands that our expenses are associated with salary. And single stream is associated with state-funded services. Jennifer, let me try to turn things over to you and see if there's a high-level description that you could use of the reductions that we have on the admin side, and then we can talk a little bit about how that is reflected once we get to personnel. Could you do that for us?
Sure. So on a high level, I'm going to touch on revenue first. One, we have overall less revenue than we did last year. So of course, when there's a reduction in revenue, you have to reduce your expenses to stay balanced in the budget. So we had a reduction, again, in revenue. And with personnel, we went through and we identified not only reductions in staffing on admin side, but we also went through and looked at reducing external contracts where we could, and went through a very rigorous process in trying to determine where we could make reductions to align with where our budgets are. One of the things that we got hit with that Brian had mentioned is the IDT payment, which is an intergovernmental transfer payment. That is something that the state has classified as administrative and has to be used from fund balance. So that is actually increasing our loss by the full amount of that dollars. So very high level, that's where we're sitting at from an administrative expense perspective. Do you want me to go into positions, Brian?
Well, I guess let me just kind of stop there and maybe fill in a little bit. We don't have any problem with our budget this year. Okay, I'm just trying to make this just really simple and clear. We're on target. We'll be ratcheting some things down to get ready for next year, but it is simply that we cannot sustain that same level of spending for next year, and especially not for the year after. To put it in perspective even more, we're going to show a net loss this year because the amount of money the state took for us in fund balance that we had to replace with single stream and the amount that we used in fund balance put us a little bit below the line. So while that's not a danger per se, again, it's just a feature of the dynamics of our budget. And again, we could have been more conservative around how we used our fund balance for advancing priorities. If we had, we'd simply be paying back more. So you see, there's not really a great spot here. I mean, we did what we did. It's been helpful. It's been important for the organization and for the community, but we can't sustain it. And I guess there's just, no fancy way of saying that. We have to retract.
Given the circumstances, I'm glad that the
Right.
board was aggressive in their forward
Right.
putting it together.
Right. So, in terms of our own personnel, what we had to do was go in and create savings to get our use of fund balance. We'll still be using fund balance to supplement our admin costs somewhat, but at a much lower level this year. We're still counting on making Medicaid savings, so we're not completely, bailing out on the use of fund balance. And the hard part with this is to talk about the reductions that are associated with the single stream reductions that are part of the Senate's version of the budget, and those things that we would have had to reduce anyway. And you just say that over and over again. This is going to be confusing for people. It's challenging for us in terms of the staff because they're going to see things that are reductions, a reduction in force with positions. They're going to see service reductions and say, well, if the Senate puts all of that money back, are you going to be putting all of those things back? No, we won't. Irregardless of what happens with that single stream issue, we still need to make reductions because of the demand on our fund balance is so great that it can't be sustained. The fact that there would be another single stream reduction would be like, a counterpunch, if you will. That would put us into a position to have to be even more conservative. And then the second year cut is even worse. Essentially, within 2 years, and we're not alone in this, Trillium is in worse shape than we are. Within 2 years, our fund balance would be down to essentially nothing. I think the projections that Jennifer did is the available cash, let's say, of about $13 million. So you see how much they're taking out of us. And some of it we've done ourselves, again. But what we need to do is to get on a spending plan now that is in keeping with the amount of available revenue. So the next kind of layer to get into around this is how are we going to do that? There's personnel and there's services. And the biggest part of this is personnel for us. I sent out to each of you just a copy of an email that I sent out Friday afternoon to kind of kick this off with folks to say, look, we're facing an unusual collection of stressors here. It is also combined with a reorganization that we're doing. So here we have another factor again. Do we believe that whole person care, special needs planning, our expertise in complex care is the sweet spot for us? Absolutely. as part of our strategic plan. We've spoken over and over about that. We've invested in that. We need to continue to prioritize that. That means we can't do everything. If we're going to do that and, you know, stay strong with that, that means we're not going to be able to do other things. Now, we don't have to do that, but that's the path we've chosen. And it's the right path to be on. If you believe anything the Secretary's saying, if you believe all the conversations around special needs planning, information from our retreat, we have made the right decisions when we've gone in the right direction. It's just that we can't do it all. So, here's how complicated this gets. There are, and I'll let Don and Jennifer get into this with you, but I'll do this on a high level. There's going to be a number, and these have been initiated today, in fact.
Started today, yes.
And they were, the precursor to that were conversations that ELT members and senior directors had with their divisions Friday. In some cases, we're having reductions in force, and in some cases, we are establishing new positions. Now that's a hard one for people to get their heads wrapped around, because all things being equal, why would you have more positions and then add positions? Well, because we don't have the right kind of positions to go forward in the way that we need to go forward. So it's the price we pay for our plan to be left at the end of the day and to succeed in being able to contract for special needs planning and whole person care. It's not at all unlike, and again, for those of you that have been around for a while, it's much like when we went live on the 1915 BC waiver. It's the same kind of thing, where we had to change the organization to fit the direction we were going in order to be successful. And we're doing the same thing again. It happens to come at a time when there are also all these other huge pressures financially, if all of that makes sense to you. So how do we go about, you know, figuring out these reductions in force? And again, between Don and Jennifer, you know, we can give you the numbers on this to give you the scale. First, we looked at empty positions. And then we went in a very painstaking manner, several days, and went department by department and prioritized those things which are contractually required and are priorities for the organization, and had to just squeeze out as much efficiency and effectiveness as we could, and not do some things, again, because we can't do it all. In terms of scale, between Don and Jennifer, if you want to try to give some numbers to put that in perspective, maybe our fill level current now
Okay.
versus where we'll be. And again, it's hard because at the same time we're doing RIFs, we're also adding new positions. So try to bear with all of that.
Just at the highest level, as Brian said, mentioning that we looked at open positions, authorized but open positions, and then other positions that are occupied. And through our reorganization efforts, we've identified 99 different positions that are eligible to be put into the RIF program. And that's out of a population head count as of close of business on Friday of 496 people. So 99 is a pretty significant number. Of that 99, 36 of those positions are the authorized but unfilled positions, so vacant positions. But that means that there are 63 positions that are currently occupied by Vaya employees that are included in this RIF activity, this RIF program that we're conducting this week. In addition to that, like Brian mentioned, there are other positions that are new that have been created based on reorganization efforts and refocus of how we manage our groups internally. Those are 32 new positions. So when you do the math of the 63 employees who are affected by the RIF, they'll have the opportunity to apply for up to 32 new internal positions. So, in the absolute best case scenario, if you want to call it that, that 32 from 63, so 31 net employees will lose their jobs with Vaya over the next few weeks. So we will be 31 smaller. So 496 to 465 on the head count by the 1st of July is the target.
Let's just stop at that point and make sure you understand the, I guess, the math of how this is working and the why.
Are all those full-time positions?
Practically all. We have very few part-time positions anyway, so practically all would be full-time.
And has there been an analysis of the cost of salaries for the new positions? Will you end up, what net savings will you end up with?
Good que- And I think Jennifer can chime in a little bit on that, because that's clearly one of the big goals for doing something like this. Jennifer?
Jennifer, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. There's other noise and I couldn't hear the question clearly.
Okay, the basic question is with these, riffing certain positions but adding other positions, what are the net savings in terms of salary costs are we looking at here?
So the overall salaries with Fringe is a reduction of about $1.5 million. However, if you look at our expenses in comparison to the whole, salaries and Fringe actually remains almost the exact same. As far as where we're spending our dollars on admin dollars, it still ends up being 2/3 of the costs are being spent on salaries and Fringe, even after the reduction.
If you do high level.
So as a percentage of our total available funds for spending, it actually stayed the same even though the total dollars went down. But again, part of that's because our overall revenue is down.
If you do high level comparing last year's, it's this year's budget to next year's, in total dollars, what does that look like?
So next year's total dollars are $33.3 million. And in last year's budget, the budget was $34.8 million.
And that's,
So it's down by 1.5.
total agency budget last year
For
versus this
administrative
year?
expenses,
Mhm.
actually expenses stayed relatively constant. Total administrative expenses last year budgeted. Although I will put a caveat on this because some of this is being compared to the fiscal year 16-17 budget of the current version, which is version 3. And we are aware of changes that we'll be presenting in June that will actually increase the expense level. There are things like the intergovernmental transfer payment where we reserved fund balance, but we didn't actually show it as an expense. So some of those there's some detailed differences that I'll have to go through when we go through this in detail on Thursday, that there are some differences there that'll make it look, that I'll have a shot to explain better when you have figures in front of you. But overall, our administrative expenses in fiscal year 16-17 were $59.1 million. This year is at $59.3, but that's not a complete apples-to-apples comparison because the budget needs to be adjusted for the current year for things like the intergovernmental transfer payment will increase that amount by over $2 million. So a better figure might be to compare it to is 61.4 million versus 59.3.
And this is hard to do without all the budget documents in front of you, and again, the purpose of this is not to do that per se, but it is to make you aware of the fact that we're having these conversations with employees, And we know that sometimes employees go and talk to other folks, which they certainly have every right and ability to do. So, making sure that all of you were aware of that, as well as the fact that we're dealing with a budget that is different from years past, both in terms of personnel and service and total dollar. And it is simply a correction to the pressure on our fund balance and the use of those dollars. So,
Hey, but can I ask a question about the fund balance?
sure.
Is there a limit past which we can't go? For the
Great.
reduction?
Great question. Let me tell you a little story. We, a small number of us, myself and Steve Owen, who works for the the legislature and fiscal research, Lisa Wainwright and Dave Richard, came up with language that would have, well, it did, in fact, agree to what is a reasonable amount of fund balance that an organization like us should have, taking into account that there was a policy decision, well, there, I guess, was, and the basis of the waiver and this public model was that it would allow reinvestment. That's going to stop with this, okay? But in order, if we wanted that to continue, where would we draw the line on having enough money? And that went, I know that language went to the General Assembly, but it's mysteriously been not present in any of these budget deliberations. So, the question, Jay, is, a matter of what's your safety zone, I guess. There's a lot of things, and again, you remember that of our fund balance, and let's use that term, probably 65% of the money that's in there we can't touch, or it can only be touched under very specific circumstances, so that the amount of available cash starts to shrink. And at what point is that available cash at a level where you say we can't go any lower? But what we're doing is really putting the brakes on this year to not get there. Now, is there a specific number? No, there isn't. Jennifer can talk about, and we've gone back and forth on this, we've taken a pretty conservative path. And in fact, the budget that we're doing for the first part of the biennium appreciates that it's likely there would be additional reductions in the second year. So this is kind of a new, we've taken a very conservative, painful path with this. Now, Jennifer, whatever you want to say about that from an accounting perspective would be great.
We definitely are looking at the projections for the next 2 years because the Senate bill actually specifically identifies recurring and non-recurring cuts and intergovernmental transfer payments to be paid in the following fiscal year. One of the things that is probably the biggest struggle is, the three ratios that we need to maintain. One of the things that we should be looking at is whether or not any of the ratios become in jeopardy. But with the way the ratios are calculated, we should be fine even though the fund balance gets decreased. The problem is that so much of our cash is tied up in money we're not allowed to touch. So there are certain things that we have to have offsetting cash for that are in fund balance that we're not allowed to use, things like risk reserve. And so when you're doing some of those calculations, it's artificially being increased to look as though we have more. People are looking at cash as a total, not what's actually available. And that's where we're really ending up with trouble, is that when we start looking at from a financial perspective, projecting out over the next few years, the available fund balance that can be spent decreases significantly. And Brian already mentioned to you it's low teens over the 2-year projection. And even in looking at year two's recurring amounts, that number gets dangerously small in 3 years.
Now, again, I said,
So again, just re-emphasizing the reason for doing the reductions and getting in line with the revenue that we're receiving.
now this dynamic is not particular to us. I would say Trillium and us are similar in that we're similar in size and scope, but they also had an aggressive reinvestment plan. So you see, we're at 8.5% of the single stream share, they're at 8.1. Their projections would have them being essentially broke in 18 months. So their fund balance, their cash balance would be run down to essentially nothing in 18 months if all of this were to continue without reductions, without them making reductions in single stream, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you some perspective. So some of us, depending on how much money we had, are affected differently. The others are going to have to pay it out in using their fund balance against the single stream, if that makes sense. And we can make this chart available for you at the board meeting so you see. You're between a rock and a hard place. I'd say, we did better. We spent the money on things we wanted to instead of having to give it back. At the end of the day, you still have less money.
So Brian, you would still proceed with these proposed reductions in force even prior to the Senate and House reconciling their budget?
For the most part, yes. On the service side, and I've tried to organize this into, there's money, there's positions, and there's services. Again, to keep this at a very high level, the next part would be Jennifer and Donald talking about the service reductions. The service reductions that we would take regardless of the single stream, and then the types of services that we would have to look at reducing if the Senate reductions go in. Okay?
And I say some of that because I'm being very mindful as a board that we have high-level kind of fiscal budgetary responsibilities and policy. You mentioned the strategic planning. But I know that we're always going to have to rely on staff for the management side and making some of those difficult decisions. But understanding the big whys, I think, will be very helpful.
Well, they just are what they are. We used fund balance aggressively. We have a very dynamic budget. This is not like a more traditional fixed budget where you're going to get this money, your expenses are going to be that much. We pushed a lot of new money. We spent a lot of new money because we chose to do it. And again, good thing, bad thing, we kind of been through that. Now what we have to do is way slow that down because there continues to be extra demands on our fund balance. And those things that we spent the money on, Mercer and DMA have rejected our attempt to have those reflected in our PMPM, which is the ongoing funding. And
Brian,
reorganization around continuing to prioritize the whole person care activities that we are involved with. So that's really it. Rick and someone else, go ahead.
Brian, this is Nancy. Of course, my mind is going around the consumers and the fear that's going to be out there, not understanding as much as we understand right now where we're at. Once these decisions are going to be made as to services, reduction in staff, is there a way that you have thought or Christine or somebody, how you're going to get this out into the community in order to not put our consumers in such a state of fear that they're gonna lose, or we're going away, or, and make sure that they understand why this is happening and not coming back, that we just don't wanna do anything anymore. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, and it's not gonna be easy, Nancy, because it's a combination of things, okay? And let me try to walk you through that. On the one hand, do we want people to be concerned, I'll use that term, that the Senate is getting ready to take, let's see, $80–90 million off the table next year, and another $120 million next year? We want people to be concerned about that as far as that resulting in service reductions? Yeah, we do. I'm sounding the alarm on that one. People need to be real upset, they need to be angry about that. Because that's real people and real services, that's not on us. That's on the General Assembly, okay? And there's, going to be various, I'll say, campaigns around educating providers, consumers, family members around that risk that people need to call their legislators about, okay? Now, the reductions that we face are in our staff is just part of, it's the grist for the mill of being in the business that we're in, and being part of a very dynamic budgeting process. So, are we in trouble? No, we're not in trouble. If we didn't do these things, would we be in trouble? Yep. We're responding to the forces that impact us. We're always in the food chain. There's nothing about this that makes us weaker per se. We continue to prioritize the things that are going to be important in the future and are important today. It's simply acting within the amount of funding we have. And Nancy, that's never something that comes across crystal clear to people. We can only do the best we can do with that.
So Brian, you've always.
Thank
Sorry.
So, Brian, how much time before you anticipate before the House, all this actually happens? I guess that's when they adopt the budget.
Going to be, I can only
Couple
repeat.
weeks.
Yeah, I can only repeat what I'm told, and everybody else can decide how realistic it is. First off, DHHS is, and all of these things are intertwined in some manner. DHHS is putting their legislative packet together by late next week. How that influences things is to be determined. The House is, they're saying they're throwing out this and that the Senate has done. But there's a lot of talk on having a budget to the governor by the 15th of June. In order to do that, predictably, the scenario would be that in very short fashion, the House is going to have to come up with a budget within a week or two, and then they would go to conference committee to try to get a budget done by June 15th. So they're moving very, very rapidly. Now what I can tell you is that the word that I'm getting from House members who feel able to have discussions about this is that they, in their version of the budget, are only putting, I think, around an extra $15 million in. So they're not setting it back to good again. So if you figure that in conference committee, is there going to be a big whoosh of cash that they're going to find and put like a whole bunch in? Well, I'll let you decide what you think about that.
Has the association been contacted about, I know that we, at the meeting last week, we were going to send a resolution, but do you know the association, anybody come talk to them? Has Ronnie talked to them, do you know?
I know they've been contacted, I don't know, I'll use the word disappointed that they haven't had a more vigorous response to date. And whether that's being formulated now, Ronnie said that, he was working on a resolution. I think very important that they see the action that we've taken on behalf of our County Commissioner Advisory Board. So whatever technical assistance we can provide to you, Billy, on getting that out to legislators and the leadership in the County Commissioners Association is really, really timely and important.
Yeah, I'm gonna work on that tomorrow.
This is Pat. What can police if anything do to help?
Great question, Pat. I think the easiest thing to do is to ask the House to put back the single stream money, because that's going to result in cuts to people. And there's a part of this that we haven't, I want to make sure we do the services part of this for Donald and Jennifer. Answer your questions, but that's the last chunk still to talk about in terms of what's the impact on the budget. So can we do that and then do more questions? Okay. So how we've tried to isolate this is to say, what are those things, those services, that essentially we used fund balance for to get going. So we over-committed on the single stream side, okay? We overfunded those services using fund balance because that's the only money there was to do things. And if there's more competition for that fund balance and it's going to be less available, then obviously we have to restrict that. We have to just live with that, okay? So there's those things that are going to happen no matter what. And there are those things that, depending on the size of the single stream reduction in the state budget, that represents another category of reductions we would have to have, okay? Does that make sense to folks? Again, I'm trying to be very deliberate around those things that we would have to do anyway, given that DMA and Mercer did not accept any of these expenses as part of our capitation. We spent fund balance. Given those features, we have to reduce. So Donald, do you want to talk about those?
Sure, you talk about in broad terms without getting into the two specifics. In this initial phase for FY17, we're looking at the programming that rolled out through community reinvestment, as well as other programs across our catchment area that we think we can make reductions on while limiting the impact directly on members. So an example of that would be our Caldwell facility-based crisis that we just opened up in April in Caldwell County. We have not fully operationalized the behavioral health urgent care piece of that facility. Right now it's a 12-bed facility-based crisis. The BHUC portion of that is another $1.2 million that we were going to operationalize. In the next fiscal year, we would choose not to operationalize that facility fully. The impact is, law enforcement drop-off, ED, people get stuck in the EDs, so there's a significant impact on the system, but not directly on services. So we would be looking at those types of programming where we can choose not to fully operationalize services that we invested in and we're moving forward to, as well as some programmatic expenses that we have across the catchment area. Like we fund some unique programs in certain areas for domestic violence and some other things that we would choose not to fully fund going into next year. If the reductions by the Senate take hold going into next year, we're looking at pretty dramatic reductions in our overall services. And because of the way that our budget is lined up, a good portion of our dollars that we serve for uninsured people are either encumbered through a direct allocation, meaning there's a federal fund, it's a federal allocation, that we can't use it for anything but that allocation. So we can't reduce any of those dollars to those programs in the system. And then there's a portion of our single stream dollars that uses to match state substance abuse block grant dollars, the federal block grant dollars, as well as the mental health block grant dollars. So the state's got to maintain the match for some of those dollars too. So strategically, what that leaves us is a really big hole around IDD services. It would be the first to get dramatic cuts going into the budget cycle that moves around. That's not by choice, that's just by the nature of how those dollars align in our system. So programmatic pieces like our adult day vocational programs, where IDD members, spend the day. We all have those programs in each of our counties. We would have to scale back those programs significantly, which would leave a hole. Where would those individuals go during the day? Would they have to stay home with loved ones? Would they have to find someone else? Would somebody be able to maintain their job if that happened? So those services, and then we would be looking at really rationing back the number of people we have in residential services. So our hope is we wouldn't have to close any group homes or anything like that, but we would have to dramatically reduce those services depending on the extent of the cuts. If the cuts are fully realized, that are currently in the Senate budget, where we have to reduce another $5 million plus out of that budget, we would be reducing a significant amount of the IDD services in our network and our high-end services for the most severely mentally ill, like ACT services, community support team services, that make up a good portion of our single stream funding amount. So that kind of gives you just a general overview of the impact of this going forward in the system.
So here's something important to, and I read this before because it becomes a crucial factor here in how we would do what Donald just said if these single stream reductions were to stay in place. The language, and unless it's changed, okay, each LME MCO shall offer at least the same level of service utilization as during the 2014-15 fiscal year. So we've gone back and looked at what that service utilization was. And really there's, what does that mean? You could talk about service utilization in terms of number of units of service, but not specific to services. So in one of Donald's examples, you have higher, more expensive services that you can't make available to people. Less expensive services are used. Is service utilization the same? On a gross level, yes. You could measure it by the number of people served. We have the highest penetration in the state of any LME MCO for non-Medicaid services because we've increased it. Well, we would be able to decrease that if we used number served as the metric for service utilization. And then finally, you have funding levels. And as I've said, we have over-contributed to that non-Medicaid side of the house because that's where all the pressure is. So that's what we would have to work around with that language, which is really, you tell me, what that means. That's the language. We'd have to work with that.
Question I was going to
Donald, this is Nancy. Are you talking about, when you're talking about day programs or you're talking about group homes, are you talking about like the workshop in Rutherford County? Are you talking about like Jerry's group home? Give me a little bit more understanding of what you're using for an example.
So for the day programming, Nancy, yes, I'm talking about the adult day vocational programs or advocate programs across the region. So Rutherford Life Services, as you mentioned, Polk Vocational, Transylvania program. We have probably about 20 different vocational programs across our catchment area that would be significantly impacted first by some of these reductions. And then the issue with the group home funding, if we immediately cut off new funding into those group homes. Some of those group homes would lose people, they have people maybe go on the innovations waiver, which means that those group homes, we wouldn't, put more people into those beds that they have, and those group homes may not be able to sustain themselves on the number of filled beds they have, which would create providers need to start consolidating those group homes, or finding people that are outside of our catchment area to fill those beds with funding, or else they would have to close. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. When you're talking like that, of course, my brain's going to, okay, Jerry's on the innovation, we've got 6 net group Homer on innovation, are we looking down the road that Tri-City would go away? What would I do? You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I think that the homes that have lots of innovations members in them would probably be, absolutely safe. I think that, homes that have a more higher penetration of state-funded individuals in them would be more at risk. And we could look and see where those are at. But that does become challenging, because anytime we have some really complex people in our system that don't have innovations funding, and really don't have nowhere else to go either. So it's a really fragile population.
That makes me feel a little better. Thanks, Donald.
So Brian, this is me. Where, if anywhere, do you see the board have the opportunity to have the kind of detail about the specific services and what positions are being eliminated? I'm not talking about micromanaging ways administrative. It's really hard to carry a public message if you don't understand the detail about what are you adding and what are you losing on the position side and how it's going to impact. For me, my head set counties and their citizens. So where do you see it anywhere? The board having enough detail to understand some of that? I know we're talking high level today, but it seems like y'all are already identified positions. So at what point will we know more detail on what that looks like?
Board pack is going out tomorrow, Jennifer and Tracy, correct?
Yes.
And, we'd have a full-fledged, discussion about that Thursday. All of those positions are identified. And there are, just for the sake of discussion, and again, off the top of your header from the list you have, we have, these are a lot of management positions. If I were to describe them generally, I don't know if, John, you want to try to...
Yeah, I tried to, I did keep track of that specifically, of the 63 people in positions that are being riffed. Almost half, I think the number is 26 or 7 right off the top of my head, that are positions occupied by someone who is called a manager or director or senior director. We did not just go into the org charts at the street level, so to speak. We went in at the management level as well, to look at where the greatest efficiencies and associated financial savings could be there. So it's an across the board. It's not just a lateral look, it's also a vertical look within the organizational charts as well.
That's really helpful, but for me, my interest is not so much are they managers or line, it's more how directly tied are they to services versus some of those softer components of our identity like communication and branding. And so that's the kind of detail I'm going to be interested in understanding when we're at the place of talking through that.
Well, you'll have all of that with we'll provide you with all of that. Down to the granular level. Both the positions, the RIF positions and the added positions. So again, you have to look at the totality of it all to kind of get the whole picture.
I've said it before and I'll say it again, my concern is our need to define ourselves in the future I worry places us at risk of being able to show our relevance in the here and now to people who depend on our services, and that's the tough balance for elements across the state. And fear not, they all get painted by some of the very high-profile things that happen in other elements across the state that don't see very consumer.
At the end of the day, we have a fixed amount of money to spend. You know, that is the tyranny of it all, and have less and less ability to control what that money is. So we are becoming much more conservative against an uncertain future. So it's a bad combination.
But you'll have more detailed information like Mandy's talking about by Thursday for us to look at.
Tomorrow and Thursday.
Well, tomorrow would be the
Okay.
budget, but in terms of positions, like identifying actual positions, org chart type of a thing, that would be Thursday.
Okay, okay.
Ryan, this is Nancy again. Is it okay if we immediately start reaching out to our CFAC to contact people in Raleigh as to these cuts can't happen and that they're going to affect the consumers? So can we, as chairs of the CFAC, immediately start reaching out to our CFAC members to ask them to get busy contacting Raleigh?
Yeah, there's a real simple message in that regard, and that is to not, well, for the House, because of the phase of budget we're in right now, you want to ask the House members to put back the money that the Senate took out in single stream. That specific. That's the message right now.
All right, I'll get an email out ASAP and contact a lot of them on the phone tonight and in the morning, and from our end here, we'll get started.
Now what people are trying to say, and what has been said, is that, well, those LME MCOs, they've just been stockpiling all their fund balance, okay? Well, that is incorrect. That is incorrect. There are some that have a lot of money because they have not spent, and those are the ones that are getting targeted to kick back more into this repayment scenario. So it's,
Brian, this is,
yeah, Cardinal has half of the available cash balance in the state, for example. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, Brian, this is Judy Johansson. Along the lines of what Nancy was asking, is there any way that you could draft a statement of what you just said so that we would have it worded correctly that we could share with our CFAC members?
Well, there was a
So that we
resolution.
get all three of them?
It'd be pretty, this is Billy, it'd be pretty similar to that resolution that we've got from the county commissioners, and I wonder if they should have that too.
Yeah, I don't have it. I haven't received anything in documents, only the notification of the
I can
meeting.
send that to the board
Yep.
right now.
Why don't we do this? That language that is part of the County Commissioner Advisory Board resolution has all the elements in it. I mean, it's the same, all the same dynamic, and Tracy's gonna send that out to all board members right now. Could also send out the key legislators that you should be reaching.
Okay.
Do you have the copy of that email that I sent to Billy?
Yes.
Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna identify the House members who are in leadership positions that should especially be the targets of your communication. That'll be in that email that Tracy sends out, as well as the County Commissioner Board resolution. So you'll have the people that you should contact and the message.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful if we're kind of all concentrated in those areas that they pointed out.
The Provider Advisory Council has also been working on this, and I think everybody understands
What about the council document?
who they are, the council document. And the Provider Advisory Council has come up with a similar kind of statement. You know, you're talking about, in the last 2 years, $262 million that came off the table, removed from the system, that had to be backfilled. And you're talking about another, what, 210 or $220 million in the next 2 years.
This is the same question healthcare providers have been asking with the formation of NCOs and ACOs and TLEs. If we jump in all high, what is your commitment? At what point will you not go lower? And I don't think we know. That's a scary premise.
Well, what the General Assembly is using us for a checking account right now.
In a time of certainty.
Yeah, there's about a $600 million state surplus when they're doing this. You might want to add that to your conversation too. And how many people are running around complaining about, rightfully so, the opioid crisis? People in the emergency department. Well, why does anybody think those things are happening? I have told everybody for years our biggest problem is the non-Medicaid population, the huge number of people that go without services. So what's happening? More money is getting taken out of that side of our budget. I do not understand the policy or the fiscal plan associated with this.
Just see if there is.
I have not heard anybody articulate one, other than to say that we got a lot of money, that we've been stockpiling money. And you know, the irony about all of this is not a time for us to stick our heads in the sand or get a bunker somewhere. It's not, unless you wanted us to just quit, you know. And that's never been the plan. It's, you know, we got to stay in the game. You know that we are, we have a lot of value. It's just that we're getting kicked around quite a bit right now. So,
Right, this is Nancy. I'm going to ask another question that probably may or may not have an answer to it. But do you think a lot of this continuing this year with the budget, continuously taking out money, thinking we have money, comes anything close to coming from Cardinal stupidity with their pay and salary and what's come out from there?
oh, it's another kind of, you know, we live in a soundbite world, Nancy. We live in a soundbite world, so because of that, people say, well, look, they can pay those kind of salaries, they can do those kinds of things. Well, we're not doing that. And, you know, so if you think someone needs to be, you choose the word you want, punished, managed differently, that's a question for DMA. I mean, where's the accountability here? You have DMA and you have a board with Cardinal that has accountability around that. You know, I can't do anything about that. Can I be victimized by it because people use that as a soundbite? Yup. You know, people don't understand this stuff. It's very confusing and very difficult for people to understand. they repeat sound bites. They repeat sound bites for things that advance a position that they have a belief in for whatever reason. Again, I cannot connect for you the budget and policy pieces that make sense from this.
Thank you.
It's about as far as we can get
Fine.
tonight, I think.
We'll get ready for Thursday.
Okay?
Does anybody have anything else? Brian, do you have anything else you need to?
No, I mean, and again, I appreciate everybody's ability to participate and kind of bear with us in this. It's a lot to pull together because there's a lot of moving parts, and just being as transparent as possible around all of this. Okay?
Okay.
All right? Thank
If
you.
there, if there's no other business, is there a motion to adjourn and we'll see everybody Thursday?
So moved.
Is there a second?
This is Pat.
Okay. Nancy makes a motion, Pat second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Whoever's left on the call? Okay. Thank you, everyone, and we will see everyone Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.